The footsteps echoed through the rain-soaked buildings as Rome advanced, unaware of the danger closing in around it. Every drop of rain felt like a warning. Every shadow hid a secret. And yet no one imagined they were about to face the greatest military humiliation in their history. This is where it begins. The night Rome stepped into the cage, without knowing it would never leave the same. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because what you're about to witness is one of the darkest chapters Rome ever faced. Imagine marching through a silent forest and realizing too late that the silence isn't peace, but the sound of a trap closing. Every step the Romans took that night pushed them deeper into a darkness they couldn't see, a betrayal they couldn't sense, and a fate no empire could escape. Tonight, you'll witness the exact moment Rome stepped into the cage and never came out the same. The narrow road cut through the forest like a damp, silent serpent, and every step of the legionaries stirred up the smell of wet earth that seemed to warn that something was wrong. The march moved too slowly, too heavily, too uncomfortably for an army that was used to dominating any terrain. Varus rode at the front, confident, convinced that nothing could happen to 3 full legions. He saw Germania as a disciplined province, tamed, almost pacified. But the truth is that path had never been safe. It was just that no one had the courage to say it out loud. The sky had remained gray since sunrise, dragging a thin rain that turned the soil into mud. The trees were so tall and dense that they blocked the light, creating dark tunnels where any movement could be a threat. The Germanic auxiliaries, supposedly allies of Rome, walked beside the legionaries with expressions no one could quite decipher. Some Roman soldiers whispered that the natives spoke cryptic words in their own language whenever they thought no one was listening. And still, Varus ignored every warning sign. He ignored the sudden silence of the birds. He ignored the messengers who never returned. He ignored the wiped-out tracks, as if someone had passed through just hours earlier to hide something. The commander repeated the same thing over and over, that this was typical of Germania, that the rain was normal, that the slow pace was temporary, that Arminius, the young allied prince, knew exactly where he was leading them. And every time Arminius returned to speak with Varus, he brought that polite, controlled smile. But the soldiers noticed that his eyes never lingered on the legionaries for long, as if he carried a secret locked in his throat. The march continued, but the air grew heavier with each passing mile. The metallic sound of armor felt louder than usual, as if the forest were throwing the echo back in a disturbing way. Some horses reared for no reason. One of the squires swore he saw shadows moving between the trees, but the centurion silenced him before he could finish the sentence. "No one wants to hear nonsense during a march," he said. Yet even the centurion never removed his hand from the hilt of his sword for the rest of the way. A knot of unease tightened in the chest of every legionary. Germania was not Rome. It wasn't flat, it wasn't orderly, it wasn't controlled. There, every tree felt like it was watching. Every trunk seemed to hide something. Every step seemed to drag the army deeper into a trap that had no shape yet, but was already too real to ignore. And still, Varus pushed forward, as if nothing was happening, as if the forest were just a forest, as if this march wasn't the beginning of the greatest military humiliation Rome would ever see. The rain had already turned the road into a trail of mud and dread when Arminius slowed his horse and pulled back from the marching column, letting the legionaries pass while he watched them with unreadable eyes. To Rome, he was a loyal commander, a prince raised under Roman law, trained by Roman officers, honored with citizenship, trusted by generals. But to the forest around him, to the shadows hiding between the trunks, he was something entirely different. He was the architect of their doom. Arminius knew every inch of that land, every ravine, every hidden path, every slope where a man could disappear without leaving a trace. Rome believed he guided the legions as a friend, but he had been guiding them as a hunter leading prey into the perfect kill zone. He had spent months lamenting Varus's arrogance, praising his leadership, feeding him the illusion that Germania was bending to Rome's will. And Varus, blind, proud, convinced of his own brilliance, swallowed every lie like honey. When Arminius told him the tribes were restless, Varus believed it. When he insisted the rebellion was nothing serious, Varus nodded. And when he finally proposed taking a shortcut through the densest part of the forest, Varus agreed without hesitation. The Germanic auxiliaries watched everything in silence. Their hands trembled not with fear, but with anticipation. They exchanged glances in their native tongue, sharp, quick, almost invisible, each one marking the nearness of the hour. They knew what Arminius was preparing. They had been waiting for it their entire lives. Hours before the ambush, Arminius approached Varus one last time, his cloak dripping, his posture respectful, his voice steady. He claimed he needed to ride ahead to negotiate with rebellious tribes. Varus didn't hesitate. He granted permission immediately. Why would he suspect anything? Arminius had eaten at his table, discussed strategy by his side, fought under the Roman standard. He was the perfect ally, the kind Rome loved to underestimate. The moment Arminius vanished between the trees, he dropped the Roman composure like a discarded mask. His horse leaped forward through the mud as he sped toward the warriors hidden deep in the woods. Thousands of them silent, invisible, waiting for his signal. Spears sharpened, bows drawn, war paint dripping under the rain. The forest didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a creature opening its jaws. Meanwhile, back in the column, a strange unease crawled over the soldiers. The auxiliaries began to drift quietly toward the edges of the march. Some loosened the straps of their shields. Others ran fingers over spear tips, as if reacquainting themselves with a forgotten friend. A centurion noticed this subtle shift and frowned, but before he could speak, a sudden gust of cold wind tore through the trees, a wind that seemed to carry whispers. Because the moment was approaching. Arminius had disappeared. The auxiliaries were changing behavior. The forest grew too silent. And yet Varus only urged the men forward, oblivious to the storm tightening around him. At that very hour, deep inside the woods, Arminius raised his arm, the signal the tribes had waited generations to see. A roar broke through the trees, fierce and ancient, shaking the forest to its core. Rome didn't know it yet, but its fate had already been sealed. The deeper the legions marched, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, as if the trees themselves were conspiring. Their trunks rose like pillars of a forgotten cathedral, thick and ancient, carved by centuries of storms. The branches wove together so tightly that the daylight died before touching the ground, leaving the soldiers in a dim twilight where every shadow felt alive. The air was heavy, damp, and cold, the kind of cold that crawls under armor and lodges itself in the bones. The path, once broad enough for formations to stand proudly, narrowed until only a few men could walk side by side. Wagons became stuck in the mud. Horses slipped. Shield formations broke apart, dissolving into chaotic clusters. And all the while, the rain fell harder, pounding helmets and shields like a war drum echoing from the heavens. But the worst enemy wasn't the rain. It was the silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence. No birds. No insects. No distant voices. Just the labored breathing of thousands of men who suddenly felt very alone. The legionaries glanced at one another, waiting for orders that never came. Varus kept shouting commands to push forward, insisting that the trail would widen again soon. But every step only tightened the noose around them. The ground sloped unevenly, dipping into trenches hidden by leaves, forcing men to stumble and break formation. Shields struck branches. Armor snagged on roots. Spears were hard to maneuver. The forest crippled every advantage Rome possessed. And it wasn't by accident. Arminius had chosen this path precisely for that reason. The forest was his fortress, his weapon, his accomplice. He knew that a Roman army was strongest in open, predictable terrain, where discipline and formation gave them the edge. But here, inside this living labyrinth, discipline meant nothing. Formations meant nothing. Experience meant nothing. Every tree was a wall. Every shadow a hiding place. Every puddle a trap. The men began to notice strange markings on the trees. Not Roman, not accidental. Symbols carved by Germanic tribes. Some were warnings. Others were victories. And a few were promises of what was about to come. A sense of dread settled over the column as the rain grew harsher. Water streamed down the soldiers' faces, mixing with sweat and mud. The downpour blurred their vision, making it impossible to see ahead. Even the most experienced veterans felt their hearts pound faster, their instincts screaming that something was wrong, horribly wrong. Then came the first sign. A shield lying half-buried in the mud. Not Roman, Germanic, fresh. A young soldier paused, knelt, touched the wood, and felt it still warm from a hand that had held it moments earlier. He lifted his head to warn the centurion, but before he could speak, a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness. Not the gentle crack of wind. A deliberate step. Another crack. Another. Surrounding them, the legionaries tightened grips on their shields. Eyes darted between the trees. Breaths quickened. The forest, once merely hostile, now felt predatory, as if watching them, waiting for permission to strike. The path narrowed one last time, squeezing the men into a battlefield they didn't know was a battlefield. And somewhere ahead, hidden behind a curtain of rain and shadows, thousands of warriors were holding their breath, waiting for Arminius to give the final signal. Rome was already inside the cage, and it didn't know it yet. The rain had thickened into a solid wall of water when the forest finally exhaled, not with wind, but with something far more terrifying. A deep, guttural roar rolled through the trees like thunder, shaking the ground beneath the legionaries' feet. Thousands of voices, primal and unrestrained, rising in perfect unison. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a sentence. Every Roman froze. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. Arrows tore through the canopy like black lightning, slamming into shields, armor, flesh. The sound was deafening, metal cracking, men screaming, horses rearing in blind panic. Spears rained down from platforms hidden among the branches, thrown with such force that some pierced 2 men at once. The legionaries had no time to form ranks, no time to raise shields in unison, no time to breathe. The forest had come alive. From every direction, shadows lunged from behind the trees. Germanic warriors covered in mud and war paint, their faces twisted in fury, swinging axes, hurling spears, smashing into Roman lines that no longer resembled lines at all. The downpour swallowed commands before they could be heard. Standards toppled into the mud. Men slipped, fell, vanished beneath boots and blood. A centurion attempted to rally his century, shouting for his men to close ranks. But a spear flew out of the darkness, striking him through the throat mid-command. He collapsed into the mud, eyes wide, unable to finish the order. His soldiers scattered like leaves in a storm. Varus tried to force his horse forward, waving desperately for the legions to reorganize, but the terrain betrayed him. The horse lost its footing, crashing sideways and trapping Varus beneath its weight. His guards rushed to help, only to be cut down by warriors dropping from the trees like predators descending on prey. The rain blurred everything, blood with water, cries with thunder, orders with chaos. Nothing looked Roman anymore. Nothing sounded Roman anymore. Nothing obeyed Roman discipline. A veteran legionary, shield dented and dripping, slashed wildly at an attacker only to stumble into a ditch he couldn't see through the mud. As he struggled to rise, a Germanic warrior stepped over him, raised an axe, and brought it down with a finality that silenced the forest around them. Formations shattered. Morale shattered. Rome's sense of invincibility shattered. The auxilia, once marching beside the legions, had vanished entirely from Roman ranks. Some were now fighting against them. Others had joined Arminius deeper in the woods, guiding the ambush with the precision of hunters who knew exactly how to bring down the strongest prey. The storm intensified, drowning the battlefield in darkness and noise. Legionaries slipped on bodies and broken shields. Horses screamed. Men tried to retreat but had nowhere to go. The forest walls were too tight, too merciless. In less than an hour, 3 of Rome's finest legions had ceased to resemble an army. They were fragments, scattered, bleeding, terrified. And the Germanic warriors, far from finished, were only getting started. Arminius had promised them Rome's destruction. This was only the opening blow. Darkness fell early that evening, as if the sky itself could not bear witness to what was happening on the forest floor. The rain had softened into a steady whisper, but it did nothing to wash away the blood that pooled between roots and fallen shields. What remained of the Roman army staggered through the mud, drenched, limping, wounded, and hopelessly scattered. They were no longer legions. They were survivors, and even Isso Esteva pressed the Madar. Torches flickered weakly in the dusk, casting trembling halos of light over faces twisted in exhaustion and terror. Every flame made the forest seem even tighter, every shadow more threatening. The once proud Roman standards had sunk into the mud, their golden eagles lying half-buried like defeated gods. Soldiers clutched them as if holding the last breath of Rome itself. The silence between the trees was unbearable. No shouts from officers, no marching commands, no unity, just the labored breaths of dying men. They knew Arminius was out there, unseen, unheard, but everywhere at once. Every crack of twigs sent men spinning with their swords raised. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of death. And when the Germanic warriors finally reappeared, they did so without a sound, emerging from the darkness like spirits born from the earth. Their silhouettes multiplied between the trees, hundreds, then thousands, encircling what was left of the legions. A veteran legionary looked around and realized they were surrounded. He whispered a prayer to Jupiter, though he knew the god could not hear him here. This was not Roman land. This was the domain of ancient spirits, and tonight they were hungry. A sudden horn blasted through the forest, long and deep, shaking the air itself. It was the signal. Germanic warriors surged forward with terrifying precision. Not chaotic, calculated, as if they had rehearsed this extinction. They moved between the trees like shadows given form, striking from angles no Roman formation could cover. Axes cleaved through shields. Spears pierced through armor, softened by rain. Some warriors carried flaming torches, setting Roman wagons ablaze, turning the forest into a shifting maze of fire and smoke. Men tried to flee, but the forest offered no mercy. Paths collapsed into mudslides. Fallen trees blocked escape routes. Streams had turned into torrents. The terrain itself seemed determined to hold them in place, to make the slaughter complete. Varus, wounded and dazed, was carried by his remaining officers toward a clearing. They begged him to keep fighting, to regroup, to attempt one final stand. But he saw the truth in the flames flickering across the helmets scattered in the mud. There was no army left to command. In a final act of despair and shame, Varus chose death on his own terms, falling on his sword rather than be captured by the people he had underestimated. His officers followed soon after, the torchlight reflecting on their armor as they fell. Nearby, the remnants of the 17, 18, and 19 legions made one last attempt to form a circle. Shields locked, spears raised, faces grim, but they were fighting ghosts in a forest that did not want them. The circle collapsed in minutes. Screams echoed upward, swallowed by the treetops. Metal clashed until it broke. Voices cried out until they faded. And then silence again. A silence deeper than before. A silence heavy with the weight of an empire's pride broken in the mud. By dawn, not one Roman standard remained. Not one formation. Not one trace of those thousands of men who had marched into the forest, believing themselves invincible. The legions had not just been defeated. They had been erased. This was the night Rome learned that even an empire could be swallowed whole by the darkness. When the sun finally rose over the Teutoburg forest, it did so timidly, as if afraid to look directly at what remained beneath the trees. A thick mist clung to the ground, swirling between broken shields, splintered spears, and bodies half hidden by leaves and mud. The battlefield was unrecognizable, not a victory site, not even a graveyard, but a void, an emptiness carved into the land and into Roman memory. Word of the disaster did not travel by messenger. There were no messengers left. It arrived like a ghost, whispered from tribe to tribe, from frontier to fortress, growing heavier with every retelling. By the time it reached the empire, it was no longer a rumor. It was a nightmare. In Rome, Emperor Augustus listened in stunned silence as the surviving auxiliaries and scattered fugitives recounted the impossible. 3 full legions, the 17, 18, and 19 gone. Not defeated. Not broken. Gone. Swallowed whole by a storm of rain, forest, and betrayal. The emperor's face drained of color. He walked alone through his palace for hours, whispering to himself words that historians would never forget. Varus, give me back my legions. Varus, red legions. He repeated it for days. Some said he beat his head against the walls. Others said he tore his clothes. None of it seemed exaggerated. The loss was too great to measure. The psychological impact spread faster than any army. Border towns panicked. Veterans questioned their faith in Rome's invincibility. Young recruits hesitated before taking the oath. For the first time in generations, the empire felt vulnerable, mortal even. Strategically, Augustus ordered immediate changes. No more reckless marches. No more blind trust in tribal alliances. No more arrogance in unknown lands. Fortresses were reinforced. Roads rebuilt. Commanders retrained. Senators debated whether Germania was even worth the effort. And as years passed, something unprecedented occurred. Rome stopped expanding in that direction. The forest beyond the Rhine became a boundary marked not by a river, but by fear. The numbers were staggering. Almost 20,000 dead. 3 legions erased. Standards lost. A humiliation worse than defeat. Commanders slain. Auxiliaries defected. Faith in Roman supremacy shattered. Augustus ordered that the legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 never be restored. No new legion would ever again carry those cursed numerals. It was as if the empire itself chose to bury the memory deep underground, hoping time would muffle the shame. But the wound never fully healed. Years later, under Germanicus, Rome attempted to reclaim some honor by recovering the lost standards. They succeeded, but the legions themselves remained ghosts. The forest of Teutoburg still held their bones, their armor, their last screams trapped in the damp earth. For the Germanic tribes, the battle became legend, a moment of unity and triumph. For Rome, it became a warning carved into the empire's soul. Pride can kill an army faster than any spear. The empire continued to grow, but something fundamental had changed. The myth of Roman invincibility had died in the rain that day, and every emperor who followed would feel the shadow of that forest lingering behind every campaign, every expansion, every ambition. Teutoburg was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a reminder that even the mightiest empire can be humbled, not by a larger enemy, but by its own blindness. Rome survived, but its confidence never fully returned. The forest had taken more than legions. It had taken certainty, and Rome would spend the rest of its existence trying, unsuccessfully, to reclaim it. Now tell me in the comments, would you have trusted Arminius or sensed the betrayal before it struck? I'm reading everything. If this story shook you, leave your like. It helps this channel grow and brings more epic battles to life. And of course, subscribe and activate the bell, because the next chapter of Rome's forgotten history is coming soon. See you in the next campaign.